In 280 BC, Pyrrhus's troops would win a stunning victory just to the west of Heraclea. The Greek elephants would smash through the Roman lines, and the cavalry, which had never seen such beasts, would be put into a frantic rout. The victory was utterly decisive, though it had cost Pyrrhus some of his most experienced men and many of his best officers. Laevinus would gather up the remnants of his army and quickly set off for Apulia. Pyrrhus had already gained the support of the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians, and he feared following the battle, more Roman cities were likely to defect to the Epirot king. Pyrrhus's force would remain encamped near Heraclea. He was still awaiting the arrival of the allied tribes which were yet to join him. This both frustrated him and made him proud that he had beat the Romans with only his core Epirots. While he was waiting, Pyrrhus began surveying the situation. He had received news that several southern Greek cities were joining him. He had hoped both Campania and Apulia would also revolt, though Laevinus's quick action had meant Apulia was now firmly garrisoned with Roman troops, making a revolt nearly impossible. Pyrrhus thought that to win the war, he would have to march on Rome itself, forcing him to move through the heavily garrisoned towns of Campania, which he thought would be both costly and slow. Instead, he favored peace with Rome. He had achieved his aim of halting any direct threat to Tarentum, and had received both honor and prestige from his great victory. Pyrrhus would send Cineas to Rome with peace terms. He asked that the Romans recognize the independence of his Greek allies, and refrain from interfering in the affairs of Magna Graecia. In return, he promised to release all Roman captives, and arbitrate any future disputes they might have. When Cineas presented these before the Roman Senate, they were initially willing to accept the terms, though following a speech from Appius Claudius Caecus, a former consul, who deeply denounced any negotiations with a foreign invader, the Senate rallied around him and soon demanded that Pyrrhus must leave Italy before they would resume their talks of peace. To Pyrrhus, this was unreasonable, and he soon began preparing his army, which was now bolstered by a large contingent of Italian tribesmen. His first aim was Campania. If he could wrestle it from the Romans, the door to Rome itself would be open. Laevinus, once he received news on his enemy's movements, would quickly rush his army west. Before Pyrrhus arrived, he was able to bolster the garrisons of the Campanian cities, making a quick siege impossible. Once Pyrrhus realized this, he would resort to raiding the countryside, hoping to force the cities into surrender by sheer intimidation. Though it soon became apparent the arrival of Laevinus's army had hardened their resolve, and not wanting to get tied down into a protracted siege, he instead aimed to bypass the cities and march on Rome directly. His army would advance as far north as Praeneste, roughly 23 miles or 37 kilometers from Rome, before his scouts would bring him grave news. Since Rome had been sacked by Brennus's Gauls in 390 BC, the walls and garrison of Rome had been improved, and would not fall without a prolonged siege. Worse yet, Rome had made peace with the Etruscans, freeing up Coruncanius and the Second Roman Legion, which had been stationed in Etruria to march south against Pyrrhus. If he stayed, he would be trapped between 3 Roman armies. He would soon turn his force around and march back through Campania, where he would head to winter quarters in Tarentum. Over the winter, both sides knew a battle was imminent. The Romans took time to recruit new soldiers to replace those that had been killed the previous year. They also replaced their consuls. Publius Decius Mus took over the northern army, while Publius Salvero replaced Livinus. In Tarentum, Pyrrhus did not have the luxury of a vast manpower pool like the Romans. His most prominent force, the Phalangites, were made up mostly of Epirates, with Macedonians and some Greek mercenaries supplementing their ranks. Though as they were in Italy, these men were hard to replenish. He managed to recruit some Italian Greeks, but for the most part this would be a severe problem that would impact his entire Italian campaign. By the time spring broke, the two armies were eager. Counter to what he had done the previous year, Pyrrhus instead aimed to attack Apulia. Though he likely knew that, similar to Campania, the cities had been reinforced with Roman garrisons and would not surrender easily. It was more likely just a ruse to get the Roman armies to attack him on his own terms. His main force would take up position just south of Asculum, along the Aphidus River. The Romans likewise would march to meet him with both consular armies. On a warm summer day in 279 BC, the two armies would form up for battle. Just as they had at Heraclea, both armies were deployed on opposite sides of the river. The Romans deployed their standard triplex acies formation. Their infantry contingent numbered roughly 40,000 men, with 16,000 of these being Roman legionaries, while the other 24 were made up of various allied troops. On the flanks, the Romans deployed roughly 5,000 cavalry, splitting them between the two flanks. The Romans also deployed roughly 300 anti-elephant wagons, armed with iron spikes, spears, missile troops, and incendiary devices. On the other side, Pyrrhus deployed his infantry in the center, with roughly 38,000 men. His elite Phalangites were placed on the right, with his Greek mercenaries and Epirate tribesmen in the center, and the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians on the left flank. He matched the Romans with roughly 5,000 cavalry on his flanks, and preserved an elite 2,000-strong cavalry force in reserve behind the line, with his 19 war elephants and skirmishers positioned behind them. Pyrrhus's deployment was initially along the riverbank, though he soon realized that the uneven ground made it harder on his phalanx, and after a short exchange with the Romans, agreed to pull back from the river to flatter ground in his rear, and allow the Romans to fully cross before engaging them. Pyrrhus hoped to use his infantry to hold the Romans in place, while his better cavalry could win on the flanks, and then envelop the Roman center. On the contrary, the Romans aimed for a decisive infantry breakthrough. They hoped they could win this on the right flank, where Pyrrhus had positioned his Italian allies, which were incredibly good at fighting on broken ground, but lacked the discipline of the Roman troops. With both sides now reformed, they would begin advancing. Pyrrhus's force was still hampered by the broken ground, which was better than by the river, but still hindered his phalanx. As the formations closed, the Epirate phalanx, wielding their long 18-foot sarissa spears, kept the Romans at range, who formed tight shield walls and attempted to push and disorder the phalanx. On the Roman right, their troops smashed into the contingent of Italian tribesmen. On the flanks, the Epirate cavalry charged repeatedly. After delivering their blow, they would wheel around to charge again in the Macedonian style. As the day progressed, it soon became apparent the Roman right had gained the upper hand. Their disciplined formation began pushing the tribesmen back, and Pyrrhus's cavalry on the flanks had failed to make any decisive break. At this moment, the Greek troops in the center began to falter, and the Romans made several decisive breakthroughs. Pyrrhus, realizing the time to act was now, committed his full cavalry reserve to the center. His elite horsemen smashed into the tired Roman infantry, at once pushing them back and stabilizing his center. Pyrrhus now called up his elephants, aiming to smash the weakened enemy line. The Romans, deploying their own anti-elephant forces, hoped to halt the beasts before they could fully disrupt their infantry. The carts were initially successful, halting the elephants' advance, though the light infantry deployed alongside them began picking off the soldiers manning the carts, and before long what was left of the corps was forced to retreat. The elephants began to run rampant along the Roman lines, disordering and scattering the Roman infantry. Soon any hope of maintaining their formation was lost, and they were forced to give ground. On the flank, a lone Roman contingent managed to break through the Epirot lines and headed for their camp, subsequently setting it on fire. Though in the end it was all for naught, as the Pyrrhot cavalry and elephants had decisively won on the Roman right flank, and fearing the prospect of being encircled, the Romans were forced to withdraw from the field. Unlike Heraclea, they managed to keep good order and conducted a well-organized retreat. The Pyrrhic forces, seeing this and being exhausted from the battle themselves, did not give chase. As Pyrrhus looked out onto the battlefield, he is quoted to have said, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." The Pyrrhic losses numbered roughly 3,500, while the Romans lost 6,000. The battle would result in the first of Pyrrhus's Pyrrhic victories. He had won a stunning battle, but at what cost? Unlike the Roman troops, Pyrrhus's men were not easily replaceable, and as he had seen at the end of the First War, Rome would not surrender, no matter the gravity of their defeat.